Hi everybody, it's Ayla. I tweet over at A Purposeful Wife. You can find me there on Twitter. I wanted to make a video today about Columbus. I said a couple videos ago that I was going to do a Columbus Day video, and I thought I better get it done before October passes us by. So I was going to do that today. I wrote a blog about this a while ago, and so I'll probably just be reading a lot of quotes and things from my blog. So I apologize for not making direct eye contact with the camera the whole time. But I want to take you through a little bit of my background and why I studied Columbus a couple of years ago and why I came to the conclusions that I did. And the first reason I studied him was because I was given such two very different narratives when I was being educated. In elementary school, of course, we had the 1492 Columbus sails the ocean blue. Columbus discovered America. He was a hero. He was a person to look up to and to be inspired by. They had those little books about virtues, and Columbus was the example for one of those books. I believe they were written in the 70s. I remember having a couple of those when I was little. And then when I got to college, I was given the Howard Zinn version, which was Columbus was this horrible person who enslaved people and cut off their ears and like skinned them alive, and just like horrible atrocities committed against Native Americans. And so when I became a homeschooling mother, I realized I need to know who Columbus was. I need to get as close to understanding who Columbus was as possible, to be able to present a historical figure to my children that's as accurate as possible. And when I'm looking at history, I like to get to, as close to the source information as I can. I want witnesses that were there in that lifetime at the event or who knew the person. And then I want those witnesses to have either corroborating witnesses, but preferably some sort of historical evidence, that something hard and concrete that's tangible, that we can measure, that backs up their claims. With Columbus, that's very difficult. But we can, I believe, get pretty close to understanding who Columbus was by taking all of the extra junk that's been written about him and getting right down to the source. Now, one of the wonderful sources is Christopher Columbus's own logbooks, which are available. They were translated and you can read them. In his first voyage to America and his first interaction with the natives in the Americas, he wrote extensively, multiple times per day, very detailed accounts of what he was doing, why he was doing it, how him and his men went about what they did. And so that can give us a really great idea. And a lot of people will come back and say, well, how do you know what he wrote about himself was accurate? How do you know that what he said he was doing, he actually did, or maybe he was just trying to look good to history? But the problem being that back when Christopher Columbus was alive, it was perfectly fine. It was not considered politically incorrect to go into a country and a land. If you had superior manpower and superior strength, you could conquer it, enslave that population, take it over, and take all of their resources. There was absolutely nothing seen as being wrong with that. For the vast majority of the population, nobody had a problem with that. And so it would be almost like in the future, let me make a modern day comparison. Let's say that in the future, in 100 years, nobody has maids. Maids are considered, even if you pay them, it's considered servitude, it's considered slavery, it's not politically correct. Why would somebody in our current time, writing their own diary, in their own journals, purposely say that they didn't use a maid or have a maid, even though it's perfectly acceptable to do so by today's standards, on the theory that in 100 years it might not be seen as politically correct? So hopefully you can understand where I'm going with that. I think that Christopher Columbus had no reason to be anything other than perfectly forthcoming in his journals. And then there's some other evidence that we can look at that help corroborate some things, and I'll take you through that. So let's begin. I'm going to take a drink first. All right, so Christopher Columbus. I came into the study of Christopher Columbus thinking that he was probably not a great guy. I was thinking he came from a time period that where the morality was not viewed as the same as ours, and I thought most likely he was a bad character. But I came out of it really, really thrilled and happy to have studied him. And I would even I would say that he was very brave, very faithful man, very smart man, and I would even venture to call him a hero. What he did was the things he did were daring, and he did it in the cause of Christ. Everything that he did was because he wanted to peacefully spread Christianity. And obviously, he needed to also fund his travels, so he needed to find gold, and that was, so he had two missions: find gold to fund his travels, and to spread Christianity. And he was really a true Christian hero in that regard. Um, so let's start out with saying that after Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas, millions of native people lost their lives. That's not disputable. Um, there were large populations in Central, North, and South America that were decimated after European arrival, subsequent European arrival. Now, what we do know is that about 95% of those died of disease. We know there were individual conflicts amongst Europeans, many of whom, especially in North America, were fleeing religious persecution themselves, or starvation, or other situations, and who were moving into the Americas almost as refugees in the North, especially North America. Now in South America there was conquest happening. In North America it was a little different. But we know there was a variety of reasons that Europeans came. Some of them were refugees fleeing religious persecution, fleeing starvation. Some of them were coming as conquerors. There were individual skirmishes and battles. But we do know that 95% of the Native American population that died in the years subsequent to the arrival of the Europeans died from unintentionally spread disease. In the early part of the 1500s, germ theory was not something that was known. They didn't know about germs. They didn't know about germ warfare. There is absolutely no evidence that any European ever in the history of interacting with Native Americans intentionally spread disease. And that includes up into the 1800s. We have one letter from one soldier in the 1800s who said, hey, it would be a good idea if we infected the natives. It would make our war with them easier. He was battling some natives in a particular area. But there's absolutely no evidence that that was ever carried out. Okay, so let's get past that, because I know a lot of people get hung up on that issue. So we do know that most of them died of disease. But what we do know in particular, this did not happen for the most part did not happen when the Europeans arrived. But right after Columbus discovered the Americas, what did happen was slavery of the native population. Now, later in North and South America, there were isolated incidences of enslaving natives, but for the most part, natives didn't make good slaves. That's why the transatlantic slave trade began, and blacks were brought in as slaves. But in the particular, the islands that Christopher Columbus discovered, slavery was used horribly right after his discovery. The native population was enslaved. And we do know that during his governorship, a lot of Native Americans died. Now, did they die from ill treatment, or did they die from disease? That's one situation we have to look at. Most likely, given the historical record of what happened between what happened in North America, Central America, and South America, we can estimate that the vast majority of them died from an unintentionally spread disease, mostly smallpox. Did some of them die because they were treated poorly by Christopher Columbus himself? And this is a situation too where we have to there's the man himself, Christopher Columbus, and then there's the Spanish Empire, okay? And we have to look at them. How did they work together, and how were they separate? Christopher Columbus, if you read his logbooks, didn't really consider himself so much part of a Spanish empire. He considered himself a Christian who was trying to spread Christianity, and the way that he could do that was to use the backing of the Spanish Empire, to whom he felt that he obviously needed to reciprocate by bringing them gold and riches from the New World, but he wasn't. Um, you can see clearly from his logbooks he didn't consider himself part of them and what they were doing. Now, did Christopher Columbus personally enslave people? Yes and no. Did he personally enslave thousands of people? No, he did not. That was the Spanish Empire. Did he, though, take a few slaves when he first got to the Americas? Sort of. And let me explain how that worked. So, back in the day, when explorers were, during the age of exploration, people were going to new lands. The common thing to do when you arrived at a new land was to take a family, typically, either they would volunteer, a native family, I should say, whether you were in Africa or you were in South America, wherever you were, to take a family of natives, voluntarily or by force, and force them to live with you for a period of about 6 months. And linguists know that it takes about 6 months for the average adult, when immersed into another culture, to become fluent in a language. And while this is a horrible practice, I won't try to get around that. That is a horrible practice to take, to take them by force. If they volunteer, then obviously it's not. To take a family by force is a horrible practice. And to basically keep them, kidnap them, maybe not, they're not really enslaved, they're more kidnapped for 6 months. To kidnap them for 6 months, so in order to force them to learn your language so that they can then become an interpreter for you, is definitely morally not good. Okay? I think we could all agree on that. Now, in the context of their time, when they didn't have a lot of other options, you can kind of understand why they did it. Now, that doesn't make, I'm not trying to say that it's okay, but you can understand why they did it. Now, Christopher Columbus, when he first arrived at the islands, did take a couple of families and bring them aboard his boat. There's a little bit of confusion as to how willingly they came. Some of them we think came willingly, some of them probably did not. But anyways, he did take a handful of people in order to gain access to the language and to be able to communicate. And again, this was standard practice, so hold Columbus as responsible for that action morally as you deem fit. Okay, so that's what happened in the beginning. Now, later on, Columbus was not the one to enslave thousands of people. That was the Spanish Empire. Now, he did serve as governor during that time when people were enslaved. And again, this is where you have to make your own personal distinction. We all know that, particularly after World War II, we have a modern idea that just following orders isn't really morally acceptable in our culture today. That if your boss tells you to do something that's morally wrong, that you shouldn't do it. And certainly Christians, with the story of Daniel, we have the example of Daniel, disobeying the king when the king asked him to go against something that violated God's laws. And so there is precedent for that morality. So there's also the idea that we don't know why Columbus agreed to be governor of that area. And when I read to you about how much love he actually had for these native people, which is coming up in a moment when I read you his quotes, I think that in my estimation, it's very reasonable to see that he would have taken that governorship even over them as a master, even though they were enslaved, because he loved them so much. And because he wanted to be there. He understood that they were going to be enslaved anyways. He wasn't able to control that aspect of it. I think it's very reasonable to assume that he was there as governor in order to make sure that the enslavement process went as well as could be expected, considering it was already not a great thing. Now, was Christopher Columbus against slavery? I have no way of knowing. Okay, maybe he actually thought slavery was okay. Maybe he thought that was an acceptable thing to do, at least at first. We don't have any way of knowing. So I've kind of got out of the way the bad parts of Christopher Columbus, the parts that we don't know. We don't know his motivations. We don't know why those particular actions were undertook by him. Let's get into what we do know. So after Christopher Columbus had his third visit to the islands, the native population had been enslaved onto farming plantations. And men, women, and children were dying by the thousands. Again, most likely of disease. Columbus and his brothers were in charge at this time. And it's not 100% clear how they personally treated the natives, other than the fact that they were enslaved, which, as I've said, is wrong. All of the negative accounts of Columbus's treatment of the natives during his reign as governor comes from only one man. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, but his name was Francisco de Bobadilla, I think. Bobadilla. Bodadilla. Francisco de Bobadilla. He was sent to check up on Columbus, and after only a few days, he had Columbus and his brothers put into chains, and he returned them to Spain to face charges. Columbus wrote to a friend at court that he couldn't understand why he was being brought back to face criminal charges, that he had done nothing wrong. He had not mistreated the natives under his watch. He had done everything that he was asked to do, and he had done it with, quote, the zeal of a faithful Christian. And he said that he was, quote, given neither justice nor mercy. Once Columbus and his brothers went before the king's court in Spain, they were acquitted of all the charges. And if you want to read the charges, this is where a lot of the liberals get their information about Christopher Columbus. This is what Howard Zinn wrote about. This Bobadilla's account of what Columbus did. This is where the feeding people to dogs and cutting off their ears. That's where all of that comes from. But the Spanish court found Columbus innocent. They said he was acquitted of the charges. There was no evidence that he had done any of these things. And he was allowed to return to the islands, but Columbus could no longer be governor. But guess who was governor? Bobadilla. He had established himself as governor. So did Bobadilla have motive to arrest Columbus on false charges? Yes, he did. He wanted his job, and he got his job. Now, did the king and queen of the Spanish court have a reason to acquit Columbus of the charges and essentially say, well, there's no evidence that you did any of these things and you're innocent, but we're not going to give you your governorship back? Why would that be? Well, you have to understand the capitulations of Santa Fe. Under the capitulations of Santa Fe, the Spanish crown owed Columbus 10% of what was found in the New World. And if you think about the riches that Spain gained from the New World, 10% of that's almost unimaginable. So when Christopher Columbus at this point was old, arthritic, and was asking for his retirement money that he was owed from the Spanish crown, the Spanish crown got to say, oh, I'm sorry, we aren't going to pay you because we had to let you go. Remember, we had to fire you because of these charges. So it's very convenient. So after reading the history of what happened, the history I've just given you, I give Christopher Columbus the benefit of the doubt over the Bobadilla character. And I'll tell you why. Because I read his logs. And in his logs, he was very forthcoming about how he felt about the native people. He wasn't trying to kill them. He wasn't even trying to enslave them. He wanted to convert them to Christianity. And you have to understand, Columbus was a deeply religious man on a level that even the average priest, I think, in our society now would find stunning. He had two goals: to spread Christianity and to get gold for the Spanish crown so that he could continue to be funded to spread Christianity. And some might think, well, did Columbus try to then, just convert them by force? I mean, that makes sense. We certainly have historical evidences of Europeans converting people to Christianity through force. I don't think so, and this is why. Because Columbus wrote on his logs in October 12th, 1492, quote, "I know that they, the natives, are people who can be made free and converted to our holy faith, more by love than by force." And so you can see from this quote that he wanted them to be free, and he wanted them to be free to choose Christianity, and that he thought that that the Europeans could accomplish that through love and not by force. He had nothing but love and honor for the native peoples. He wrote October 12, 1492, quote, "They are very well-built people with handsome bodies and fine faces." He said in October 12, 1492, quote, "They traded everything with goodwill, but it seems to me that they have very little and are poor in everything. So I warned my men to take nothing from the people without giving them something in exchange." End quote. Columbus gave strict orders to his men to treat the natives with the utmost respect. When they rowed ashore to many of these islands, the villagers would see the boats, would see the people coming, and would flee into the woods. Christopher Columbus would arrive and his men would arrive at a village that had been abandoned. And Columbus actually ordered his men not to touch or take anything of the native peoples. He said, quote, "I ordered that everyone, the natives, be treated honorably because they are the best and gentlest people in the world. I gave them, the natives, glass beads, brass rings, hawks' bells, not because they asked for anything, but because it seemed to me the right thing to do," end quote. So when they would come into these villages, when they encountered the natives directly, Christopher Columbus said, you treat them with respect. You don't take anything from them without giving them something in return. In fact, he brought gifts with him to give the native people, the hawks' bells and the glass beads and so forth, brass rings. And he actually ordered his men to treat the natives honorably because they were, quote, "the best and gentlest people in the world." And again, I don't think that he would have made these quotes up, because if he had written in his journal, "These are really amazing people, we should totally enslave them and get what we can out of them and get what we can out of their land," almost nobody back then would have thought that that was a bad thing to say. Almost nobody back then obviously would have had a problem with that. So if that was his honest intent, then why not just be honest about it? Okay. December 25th, 1492, he said, quote, "I do not believe there is a better people or a better country. They love their neighbors as themselves, and they have the softest, gentlest voices in the world, and they are always smiling." So during his travel among the islands, many of the native peoples told Columbus of some tribes on nearby islands that committed horrible murders and slaughters, and that these tribal people were cannibals. They even showed Christopher some men from the tribe who had chunks of flesh torn from their bodies, scarred chunks of flesh torn from their bodies, and told Columbus that cannibals on the nearby islands had done it. But Columbus didn't believe them. He thought they were just trying to play a joke on the dumb white guy. And so he still attempted to visit those islands, which tells me one of two things. Number one, Christopher Columbus was extremely brave and very trusting and of the goodness of the native people. And number two, that there may have been legitimate reasons that Christopher Columbus, his brothers, or his men may have had to defend themselves against violent natives. There very well could have been very, very violent, savage natives on some of those islands that would have required fighting back against. Some would say, well, perhaps Christopher Columbus went into this a Christian. When he first met these people, he thought they were wonderful, they were sweet and kind, but 10 years down the road, he decided either to convert them by force, or he decided that he really wasn't a Christian, that he just wanted to get, what he could out of it, and that he decided that he should start slaughtering natives and feeding them to dogs and cutting off their ears and all of these other horrible things. But I find that unlikely, because from the records that we have from his son, Christopher Columbus only grew more devout and pious and humble in his advancing age. Now, could his son have been lying? Of course. I have no way to prove either way. These are the evidences I have. And so, in conclusion, I would venture that modern day, we can never know exactly who Columbus was and exactly what he felt and exactly what he did in all circumstances. We can't know exactly what role he played in the deaths of the native peoples of America, but it's no reason to demonize Columbus, because there are far more historical evidences of his virtues than there are of his faults. And I'll say that again, that there are far more historical evidences of his virtues than of his faults. I invite you to read Christopher Columbus's personal logs if you want to learn more about him and how he felt. You can find that was compiled by, you can find his logs online. They were compiled by the National Geographic Columbus Project in 1986. I've researched the translation work that was done on these, and I think that from what I can tell, it was very sound and well done. You can download the PDF, put it on your phone, read it. And after considering other resources to include in my assessment of Christopher Columbus, the one that I found that would give the best historical accuracy was Admiral of the Ocean Sea, A Life of Christopher Columbus by Samuel Eliot Morison. So I encourage you to go out there, read more about Christopher Columbus, read more about the people who wrote about him, about their motives, read about the context of the history at the time, and come to an understanding for yourself who you feel he was. I feel like he was a good, decent Christian man who wanted to convert the natives through love. I feel like he was wrongly accused of wrongdoing by a man who wanted to take his job, and was fired by a king and queen that wanted to deny him his rightful and legal monies and retirement that he had earned working for them. And that is my personal take on Christopher Columbus, and I hope you've enjoyed this video. Have a great day.